When Alaric, leader of the Goths, settled his people inside the northern frontier, he wanted a dignified coexistence with Rome. Alaric spoke Latin fluently, was well-read, and not about to be dismissed by pompous Romans.
We tend to think of the barbarians as a collection of Conan the Barbarian and his buddies coming across the frontier waving their double-handed axes. This is quite far from the truth. By the time the barbarians come across the frontiers, they're beginning to be Romanized. Alaric, who sacked Rome in 410, did so because he was turned down for a job as a Roman general. What these people wanted first and foremost was a place within the empire for themselves, and when they didn't get it, they turned on the government of the emperors.
But Rome had still not learned its lesson. Instead of building diplomatic relations with the Goths, local governors systematically insulted, starved, and overtaxed them. Alaric sent letters of protest to the emperor. They were ignored. When Alaric and his people finally descended on Rome in 410 AD, it was not to rape and pillage, but to drive home his people's protests and demand the decent treatment they'd been promised. To his surprise, as his army swept through the heart of the empire, there was hardly a Roman soldier in sight. The truth was, many Romans were no longer prepared to fight the barbarians. Some even welcomed them. And so in the year 410, for the first time in almost 1,000 years, Romans awoke to find an enemy army camped just outside the city. They couldn't believe it. Alaric's demands were reasonable. All he wanted for his people was part of the Danube River Valley in what is now Austria. Rome refused. Furious with Rome's arrogance, Alaric laid siege to the city. In addition, he now demanded 5,000 pounds of gold, 3,000 pounds of silver, 4,000 silk tunics, 3,000 scarlet-dyed skins, and 3,000 pounds of pepper. "Will you leave us with nothing?" asked the Roman envoys. Alaric replied, "If you give us what we want, you can keep your lives." Rome held back, procrastinated, and in the end, Alaric lost patience. Barbarian slaves, delighted by the prospect of Rome's ruin, threw open the city gates. The Goths poured in and sacked the city. Proud Rome was finally brought to her knees. Although the city of Rome was no longer the center of the empire, for Romans everywhere, seeing it sacked was an omen of catastrophe. Romans were now sure the apocalypse was at hand. Stories circulated that the mouths of volcanoes were getting bigger, ready for the souls of all the sinners they'd have to receive. Rome was now divided in half. The Eastern Empire remained strong, but as barbarians overran the West, Romans everywhere were terrified the end was at hand. But apocalyptic visions turned out to be untrue. Not only did the world not end, the barbarians didn't do much raping and plundering either. Goths, Visigoths, Vandals, and other German tribes streamed out of Central Europe and spread themselves throughout the Western Mediterranean. To everybody's surprise, they tried to live peacefully alongside the Romans. Alaric's sack of Rome in 410 AD was not the end. The Eastern Empire was still strong. From its wealthy cities in Turkey and the Middle East, it viewed the disintegration of the West with growing detachment. It would slowly become the Byzantine Empire, but go on calling itself Roman until the Middle Ages. the Western Empire staggered on for another 60 years. There were still emperors in Rome, but their control was evaporating as the power of the central bureaucracy crumbled. The Western Empire now did nothing for the provinces except tax them. Local Roman nobles soon felt they were better off without it. They came to see themselves as free agents, fortifying their estates, making their own deals with the barbarians, even intermarrying with them. This was the birth of medieval Europe, an anarchic world where local barons owed allegiance to few and built their own fiefdoms. With Rome's passing, the West's long love affair with its memory began. Paradoxically, it was the Christian Church that faithfully kept the language and culture of its former persecutor alive.
Simply walk into any church. In its architecture and design, you have just walked in to a Roman imperial palace. Sit down in that church and perhaps listen to the church service, listen to the liturgy, listen to the hymns. You are listening to Roman imperial court ceremonial. The structure of the buildings of the Christian church, its liturgy, its choirs, its priests, its bishops, are imitative of Roman imperial court ceremonial.
In the centuries that followed her fall, Rome was reborn again and again. The guiding idea of the Italian Renaissance was the rebirth of Rome and its classical ideals. When the founding fathers of the United States sought a model for their new country, it was to Rome they turned. Raised on the classics, they poured Rome's republican ideals into the Constitution. The early Roman Republic inspired democracies and high ideals down to the present day. But the empire it became left a very different legacy. When the French Emperor Napoleon claimed to have Roman blood coursing through his veins, it wasn't the Republic, but the empire and its all-powerful rulers he was thinking of.
The great danger is that we believe that the Roman Empire was a good thing. That is a 19th century view. It's the reason why in Britain people learnt the classics. They learnt the classics and they read their Livy in order to know how to govern India, because Britain saw herself as doing exactly what the Romans had done. We have not yet properly written the post-imperialist history of Rome that will come and realize that this whole thing, great though it was, has its negative side. It has its violence, it has its dark side.
That dark side of Rome was ruthlessly exploited by the fascist dictator Mussolini, who openly styled his regime as a new Roman Empire, and himself a new Emperor Augustus. For both good and bad, the whole Western world has grown up in Rome's towering shadow. Nurtured on its stories, imitating its heroes, always trying to learn the lessons of its republic, its empire, and its fall. Rome, ruthless in its lust for power, insatiable in its ambition, revolutionary in its political ideals. Its soaring spirit has never died. Rome's power and glory have branded themselves on the Western imagination forever.